The Blue Fairy and the Pyromancer by Zeiss Schreiber. Prologue. Amber wondered how long it had been since she last saw sunlight. At first, she tried to measure time by listening to her own heartbeat, but she lost track once she fell asleep and woke up in pitch darkness of her cell. She then attempted to rely on the periodic visit from the guard who came to bring her food and empty her bucket, but when her hunger became painful, she started to suspect that he sometimes deliberately skipped a visit. Desperate, she decided to risk a beating and ask him how many days it had been since her arrest, but he refused to answer. He'd probably been ordered not to speak to her, or maybe he was just afraid. Would Kieran be afraid? No, he wouldn't. Not her son. He'd always trusted her, even during the worst times. She brought her legs up against her abdomen and wrapped her arms around her knees. Her chains clanked as she moved, but she welcomed the noise. It reminded her that she was still alive. What she'd rather forget was the unpleasant smell of the bucket they left for her, and the silence, the unbearable silence pressing against her skull. So, she closed her eyes. She imagined the warm touch of the sun against her skin while she walked with Kieran to the marketplace. Imagined him marveling at all of those sweet apples, juicy grapes, and ripe tomatoes that the merchants had so perfectly lined up to tantalize potential buyers, until his eyes stopped on his favorite, strawberries. She'd buy him the ripest ones so that they could share them together later. He would smile at her, and they'd walk back home, hand in hand. The sound of approaching footsteps put an end to her reverie. Were the footsteps real, or was she dreaming? The footsteps didn't sound like those of her jailer. In fact, they sounded like multiple people. Amber held her breath for a moment and stopped moving, petrified by an idea that she'd pushed to the back of her mind up until now, that they were done with her. The footsteps stopped in front of her cell. Amber heard the tinkling of keys, followed by a loud click, and the door opened. Bright light invaded the room, blinding her, and she recoiled back into the corner to escape its radiance. When her eyes grew accustomed to it, she saw two prison guards beyond the doorway of her cell, torches in their hands. A third person stood behind them, one who Amber hadn't seen in what felt like weeks. Inquisitor Carolina Doe, the woman who'd arrested her. Even now, Amber couldn't help but notice how beautiful she was. Inquisitor Doe wasn't much older than her, maybe 30 years old, and her long raven hair contrasted starkly with the immaculate white of her cassock. What identified her as an inquisitor and not a regular Azarian priestess was the cincture that she wore around her waist, crimson red instead of common white. "Amber Fowler," the inquisitor said. "Stand up." Amber kept her head down and slowly rose up to her feet, her legs shaking. She knew what the inquisitor was going to say next, but she wasn't ready to hear it. Right at that moment, she would have preferred the silence of her cell to Carolina Doe's next words. "After extensive deliberations, the jury has found you guilty of infanticide, witchcraft, heresy, and apostasy. Your execution will take place today in St. Persephone's Square, where I will escort you and pronounce your judgment. Do you wish to receive the last rites?" Amber gawked at Inquisitor Doe, stunned. She repeated in her mind what the Inquisitor had just said, but couldn't come up with an appropriate response. Was that how she would announce her death to Kieran? So crudely and heartlessly? She felt a burning sensation grow in the pit of her stomach, and for a moment she thought that she was going to vomit. Tears welled up in her eyes and threatened to spill out, but she held them back. She couldn't let it end like this. "What about Kieran?" she asked, her lips quivering. I'm the only one he has." The Inquisitor frowned. "He will be entrusted to one of our orphanages, where he will be raised by Azarian priestesses until the day he turns 16. Her throat began to hurt. "No," she said. "Please, no. He needs me." "You should have thought about that before you joined that vile witch. If it were up to me, you would never see him again." This gave Amber pause, and with a cracking voice she asked, "What do you mean?" Inquisitor Doe sighed and reluctantly replied, "The Great Mother has judged it mercifully to let you see him one last time." Amber blinked in disbelief. After a moment of hesitation, she wiped away her tears and lowered her head. "Thank you," she said. Thank you so much." The Inquisitor stared at her and didn't bother to answer, but that didn't matter to Amber. She was going to talk to Kieran again, and she needed someone to thank for it. "Do you want me to perform the last rites?" the Inquisitor inquired. "No," Amber said. This seemed to disconcert the priestess. "I urge you," she insisted. "Your soul is at stake. Confess your sins, and God will show you mercy." There was nothing more important right now than her son. "Please, take me to Kieran." The Inquisitor clenched her teeth. "Very well, then," she relented. She turned and gestured at one of the two guards. "Reed, put the cuffs on Miss Fowler and then remove the chains." The younger of the two men stepped forward and inserted his torch into the sconce next to the door. He couldn't have been more than 20 years old, and by the way his hands fidgeted, Amber deduced that he hadn't been doing this for long. She couldn't clearly see it, but she knew the emblem on his red tunic was that of the Pyromancer order. He approached Amber and pulled out a set of keys, only for Carolina to immediately reprimand him. "What are you doing?" Reed stumbled over his own words and instinctively looked at his partner for help, but the older guard just shook his head. I'm removing the chains. You do that after you put the handcuffs on her. These restraints have been consecrated so that she can't use her sorcery on you. Do you understand?" Inquisitor Dow glared at the young man, who promptly nodded. Yes, ma'am," he said. "It won't happen again." He then took the handcuffs that dangled on his belt, right next to his brand-new wooden baton, and put them on Amber's wrists. They exchanged a short glance, one that should have meant nothing, but it lasted long enough for her to realize that he didn't want to do this. She didn't have the time to think about it, however, as Reed finished removing her chains and pushed her toward the door. He kept his hand on her arm and nudged her down the dark corridor. The Inquisitor and the other guard close behind them. Amber couldn't hear anything except for the crackling of the torches and the scraping of her captor's boots against the floor. They had confiscated her shoes many days ago, so that she had to endure the cold touch of stones under her bare feet, though she knew it wouldn't last much longer. Reed told her to take a left, but her movements were so sluggish that he had to help her walk through the dark corridors of the dungeon. It didn't take long before they arrived at the set of stairs that led up. She climbed up one set at a time, wishing that it didn't hurt so much when the handcuffs chafed her wrists. Little by little, they left the darkness of the dungeon behind and stepped into a multicolored light. Amber covered her eyes with her hands and squinted at the first stained glass window she could find. They didn't stop to let her admire the daylight, and after her escorts deposited the torches into empty sconces, she was led down a hallway. A guard that she had never seen before came out of the room, saluted the Inquisitor, and went on his way. This place wasn't just a prison, she realized. It was a garrison of the Order of St. Paraphanes. Amber's heart skipped a beat. She frantically looked for a clear glass window, and when Reed finally passed by one, she peered through it. Just outside the building was a large plaza where a crowd of hundreds, maybe thousands, had already gathered. And though she only caught a glimpse of it, she knew that what she saw on the other side of this mass of people was a scaffold, one that had been built just for her. For an instant, she stopped breathing. She had been one of those people once, a young and stupid woman who was curious to see what a human looked like when they died. She remembered the uneasiness she'd felt when the convict, a man young enough to be her brother, finally stopped moving, and now she wondered if anyone in this crowd could feel the same way about her. Reed opened a door and guided Amber into a small bedroom. Sitting on the bed was Kieran, her little boy. He looked at her and nervously said, "Mom?" "Kieran." The lump in her throat made it difficult to talk. Hey, sweetie." When Reed let go of her arm, she rushed to her son, dropped to her knees, and squeezed him tight against her chest. Neither of them said anything for a long while. His lack of reaction began to worry her, and she wondered if the Inquisitor had managed to turn him against her. But then he wrapped his arms around her shoulders and buried his head into her neck, and her lips curled into a smile at the realization that despite everything that had happened, he still trusted her. She opened her eyes, glanced at the only window in the room, and let out a sigh of relief when she realized that it was impossible to see the scaffolding from here. "Mom, they said that you're a bad person." Amber slowly backed away and met her son's gaze. Now that they were face to face, she didn't know what to say to him. She thought about explaining to Kieran what the Inquisition really was, but one glance at Carolina Doe's grim expression was enough to confirm that if she did, she'd be separated from him immediately, and she couldn't let that happen. She gently ruffled Kieran's brown hair and forced herself to smile. "Kieran, listen to me," she said. "It's very important." "Okay." Ember took a deep breath and tried to stop herself from shaking to no avail. "We're not going to see each other again, sweetie. You're going to be living with other kids from now on. You understand?" He didn't say anything at first, but his eyes told her that he understood. "Is it because you're bad?" he asked in a small voice. "Oh, Kieran." She took his face in her hands and spoke to him more softly. Tears welled up in her eyes again, and she couldn't hold them back this time. "I love you very, very much. You know that, right?" His voice cracked, but he answered. Yes." "And do you love me too?" He sobbed and said. "Yes, I love you, Mom." Ember hugged him again, as hard as she could, and he melted in her arms. She did her best to cherish this feeling and wished that it would never end. If only she'd taken him to the market to buy him strawberries one more time. Maybe then it wouldn't be so hard to let him go. The touch of Reed's hand on her shoulder reminded her that reality cared not for one's wishes. With great difficulty, she slowly broke the embrace, stood up, and looked at her son's red eyes. Tears were streaming down his face, and she used her thumbs to wipe them away. "Kieran," she said in a trembling voice, "you have to promise me something." He met her gaze. He tried to speak, but was unable to do so without sobbing, so he nodded. "Promise me to be a good boy, okay?" Kieran nodded more confidently this time. "Okay," he cried. "I promise." Ember kissed him on the forehead and embraced him one last time. She could barely see through her tears. "Miss Fowler," Reed said, "it's time." For a moment, her arms refused to move. She didn't want to leave, but she knew that if she refused, they'd drag her away by force, and Kieran shouldn't have to see that. So she let him go. Reed helped her stand up and quietly took her outside of the room. She looked at her son for as long as she could, and just before he disappeared out of her sight, she told him, "I love you." He didn't get a chance to reply. The other guard closed the door to the bedroom, and they marched down the hallway. Kieran was gone, and very soon, the only thing he'd have left of her would be memories. Lost in a haze, Amber was barely aware of her surroundings and automatically followed Reed's lead. When she felt the wind blow on her moist cheeks, she lifted her head and saw what she had dreaded: St. Paraphane's Square. The crowd had grown since she had last saw them, and new people were streaming into the streets, adding to their numbers. Every stratum of Holliesburg's population had gathered here under the scorching heat of the afternoon sun to witness the execution of what they feared the most: a witch. Amber peered at the mass of people and spotted the scaffold on the opposite side of the square. Later's temple stood behind it, its massive frame of marble and limestone dwarfing the small wooden structure, the site of her execution. There was only one way to reach it, and it was by walking through this crowd. She shuddered at the thought. She knew what would happen once they surrounded her. "Don't let any of them approach the heretic," Carolina Dow commanded. Amber looked behind her and saw that a dozen Paraphanesian guards had exited the building, all armed with wooden batons. Now that she was outside and in the sunlight, she could discern clearly the emblem of the order sewn into the deep red of their tunics, a black tree enclosed within a white shield. The guards walked forward and surrounded her, the Inquisitor, and their two comrades in a compact formation that shielded them from all sides. Reed tightened his grip on Amber's arm and nervously grabbed his own baton. She stared at him, perplexed by his anxious state. He looked back at her and opened his mouth, ostensibly to say something, but then decided against it and lifted his gaze forward instead. "Advance," the Inquisitor ordered. The procession began marching to the scaffold and the crowd. Amber wiped away her tears and tilted her head down. She could already hear the chatter quieted down at her approach, and a moment later, she saw the first of them out of the corner of her eye. She kept her head down and focused her attention on her naked feet. She couldn't hear anything except for the clank of her escort's armor and their footsteps. The citizens of Holyburg had fallen into an almost solemn silence. They shuffled out of the procession's way and then emerged back together, like water swerving around the dorsal fin of a shark. "Sinner!" someone yelled. Amber stiffened, and so did Reed. "Or," another shouted, this person much closer than the previous one. "Devil's spawn! Go back to hell!" The voices grew louder until they turned into a clamor that overwhelmed every other sound except for her own breathing. The guards slowed down and raised their batons at those who took too long to move out of the way. One man lunged forward and tried to grab Amber's hair, only for his arm to be smacked away and his face smashed in. Amber recoiled and lost her balance, and just when she thought that she'd hit the ground, Reed caught her in his arms. He helped her stand, and before she could understand what had happened, they were walking again. She had almost reached the scaffold. A dozen more guards surrounded the wooden platform, waiting for the convict to arrive. Amber tried to avoid their gaze, knowing that she'd find neither kindness nor pity in their eyes. The moment she finished this thought, something round and squishy hit her in the face. "Take that, witch!" a man shouted. Amber fell on her knees, stunned. The foul odor of rotten fruit overwhelmed her sense of smell, and she felt an urge to vomit. She couldn't suppress her sobs anymore. She frantically tried to wipe away fruit juice from her face while the tears rolled down her cheeks. "Reed!" the Inquisitor shouted. "Get her back on her feet!" The young man obeyed. He kneeled down next to Amber and whispered in her ear, "Come on, I'll help you." At first, she wondered whether or not she heard him right. Maybe the clamor from the crowd had distorted his words into something she wanted to hear. But sure enough, Reed gently lifted her by the arm and helped her to stand up again. And so they walked together. It wasn't far now, only 5 meters away. Amber approached the small set of stairs and slowly climbed them. When she looked down at the steps, she noticed many nail holes at both ends of the wood planks. This scaffold must have been assembled and disassembled multiple times in the past. Were they using the same one that she first saw years ago? The nudge Reed gave her reminded her that the time for questioning was over. He guided her to the center of the scaffold, where she saw a large iron shackle fixed into a floorboard. She remembered the next part. The convict would kneel down and wait for the Paraphanesian guard to attach the shackles to the handcuffs. And this was exactly what Reed did, albeit with shaky hands. His movements were well practiced, but she could tell that this was his first time that he'd ever done it. Once he finished tethering Amber to the floorboard, he looked up and gazed at her. She saw hesitation in his eyes, something she didn't expect. He then pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket and delicately wiped the last of the juice from her face. Amber's whole body relaxed. She gazed at Reed's gloomy expression and whispered a hoarse "thank you" to him. He froze for an instant, caught off guard by her words, and no one but Amber noticed the imperceptible nod that he gave. Once he finished cleaning her face, he put his handkerchief back into his pocket, stood up, and walked away. She now had a full view of the crowd that had gathered on St. Paraphane's Square, and she realized that not all of them were shouting at her. A few stayed silent, while a handful turned away and were leaving this place. The guards positioned around the scaffold kept the most hot-blooded of them at bay, not to protect Amber, but to preserve the sanctity of her execution. The Inquisitor stepped onto the platform. Her gait exuded unshakable confidence, the sort that intimidated even the most boisterous of men. The crowd gradually began to quiet down, and just by raising her hand in the air, she silenced the rest of them. A lull descended upon the plaza, and even though everybody's attention was on her, she waited. Seconds at first, and then a full minute. She was staring down at the whole crowd with fury in her eyes. "Citizens of Holyburg," she finally said, "I am Inquisitor Carolina Dow, a humble servant of the Azarian Church." Using her power, she sent her voice booming across the plaza, allowing everyone, even those on the far back of the congregation, to hear her speech. This display of divine power had astonished Amber in the past when she was a young girl, but not anymore. "Today is a cruel reminder of our own weaknesses. At every moment of our lives, we are besieged by wicked desires and heinous temptations. But even in these instances, we must remember not to abase ourselves to the level of those who willingly sin against the holy memory of Our Lady. And when we are confronted by a sinner like the one here today, we must remember to show them pity, not hate." Amber listened, stunned by what the Inquisitor had just said. She peered at the crowd and saw a similar reaction. For if we scorn the damned, we harm the purity of our souls. This lesson has been taught to us throughout the ages, ever since the fall of the Illyrian Empire. Amber Fowler has sinned against the word of God, and she will now answer for these crimes. Learn from her mistakes. Learn from your own. May the kind mother watch over us all. May the kind mother watch over us all, the people chanted. Carolina Dow turned away from them and walked up to Amber. This was it. This was the end. Amber Fowler, the Inquisitor said, now in her normal voice, please, let me perform the last rites. This is your last chance. Amber stared at her, feeling completely drained after crying so much. She didn't believe that confessing her sins would save her soul, not after all that she had experienced. She shook her head. Very well, Carolina said. The Inquisitor walked to Amber's left side and faced the crowd again. Amber Fowler, the Inquisition has found you guilty of infanticide, witchcraft, heresy, and apostasy. By God's will, you are hereby sentenced to death. Do you have any last words? This was the second time Amber had heard someone ask that question. She couldn't hear the convict's answer then, but other people had related to her. It had taken her years to understand the meaning behind those words, and now that she was here on what might have been the same scaffold, they were the only ones that seemed appropriate. May God have mercy on your soul, Inquisitor. Carolina Dow narrowed her eyes. She stayed silent for a long moment and then placed her hand on Amber's neck. Only a few more seconds and she'd start the final prayer. Amber clenched her teeth and braced herself for the pain. She didn't want it to hurt. She didn't want any of this. O Lady in White, I beseech thee. She regretted not telling Kieran how happy he'd made her feel the day that he came into this world, how alone she felt beforehand. Bestow upon me your power. She hoped that he'd become a good man. She wanted him to grow old, have a family, and tell them about her. For we must shatter this tower. She wanted someone, anyone, to remember her, to miss her. And one day, build it. Please, don't make it end. Not like this. It's too much. Anew. Pain. Her chest burned, but there was no fire. She gasped for air to no avail, and an acute pressure spread to her left arm and gradually to her whole body. She fell forward, clutching at her chest, but no one helped, not even Reed. Her strength was quickly leaving her, and before it abandoned her completely, she forced herself to fall on her back. She didn't want the scaffold to be the last thing that she would see. Although her vision was blurred with tears, she turned her gaze upward. Blue. There was so much blue. She wanted to fall into it, drown in it, so that it could quench the flames raging in her chest. She remembered the times when Kieran would look at the sky and tell her about all of the animals he saw swimming up there. She hadn't listened to him then. How she wished that he could tell her about them now. Tiny black dots started to pierce through the ocean blue. There were hundreds of them, emerging from the edges of her vision, and before long, new ones rose from the center. Little by little, they followed all of the color, taking the pain with them until only one black void remained behind. Amber gazed at it for a very, very long time, until finally, the void swallowed her whole.